want to express our great pleasure at having this afternoon here the leading and fabulous and award-winning investigative writer Dick Lehr. We just had a screening of Black Mass. I mean, I'm still a little bit shaken from the movie itself, even though I'd seen it before. But and really, I found, in fact, a second screening having more impact even, and also kind of emotional power.
Yeah.
I felt.
I got the chills, and I've seen it a bunch of times.
Yeah.
It's dark. It's unnerving. Yeah.
It's dark, but yet the fact that there is some justice done. And despite all that, and one of the things Dick pointed out in the conversation about the film was that in many ways Whitey Bulger was the most notorious American criminal, really, in a way, because no one had so deeply infiltrated and sort of commandeered the FBI to become sort of his protection.
Right.
Who was the head of the FBI at that point? I guess it spanned a time, but in terms of, like, your story broke in 1988.
Right, and well, the informant relationship began in the mid-'70s, and I think Clarence Kelly was the
Clarence
FBI.
Kelly, yeah. Sort of the post J. Edgar Hoover period.
And Sessions was FBI director during part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it covered a few regimes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I want to just briefly lay out some of what Dick has done. I mean, Dick was a member of the Spotlight team at the Boston Globe. Who's seen the movie on the Spotlight team? Yes, really important investigative force.
I was not on the team during that time, I must say.
During which time?
During
the movie time.
Yeah,
during the church, yeah. You were on the Spotlight team.
I was working on a book called Judgment Ridge.
Yeah, right. There we go. Yeah, I should disclose the fact that I'm developing a movie based on one of Dick's books, Judgment Ridge, which is about the Dartmouth murders that were committed by two Vermont teenagers, which Dick also reported for the Boston Globe with Mitch Zukoff, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But now, is Birth of Movement your most recent book?
It is.
Yeah, Dick, his most recent book focuses on how the release of D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation reignited the Ku Klux Klan in America, including in Vermont, interestingly enough, and how a black civil rights leader, very important, very interesting and substantial man, Monroe Trotter, Harvard graduate and really a leading civil rights leader of that time, although he's not so well known, really went out on a limb and organized substantial protest, starting in Boston, against the release of that film. And who remembers Birth of a Nation in any detail, having seen it? Yes. And it goes back in some ways to very early in Dick's career as a writer for the Hartford Courant, where he infiltrated a meeting of the Ku Klux Klan, where David Duke came to recruit people in Connecticut using the film Birth of a Nation.
Right.
Still.
Yeah.
So anyway, and we'll talk a bit about that because I think especially because of the politics of the last several weeks and what's been happening in Charlottesville and
I've been
elsewhere.
noticing that there's been lots of references in the coverage in the last couple of weeks to Griffith's film Birth of a Nation, and the connection with the monuments and the controversies and whatnot. Yeah.
What have been your thoughts related to that?
Well, yeah, no, I mean it's just a reminder. I mean, this movie was America's first blockbuster film in when it was released in 1915, it's a deeply racist movie that embeds into the popular culture all these racist stereotypes. It's a movie that ran 3+ hours, so it was an epic drama. It was essentially the Star Wars of its era. I mean, it blew everyone's mind. And it told the story of the Civil War through two families, one from the North and one from the South. And the most controversial part is the post-Civil War Reconstruction and the portrayal of ex-slaves, freed slaves. And you know, it's awful stuff. And I had seen it, and one of the reasons the book I wrote was, which Jay alluded to, The Birth of a Movement. A couple of the triggering events or the things that why I was inspired to write the book. It's my first work of historical nonfiction. Most of my other books have come off of more current events. But I had stumbled onto reading about this black civil rights leader from Boston, William Monroe Trotter, and learning that in the early 1900s, he was a nationally prominent civil rights leader and journalist. He had a newspaper, a radical newspaper in Boston called The Guardian. And he started his paper as a way to challenge the leading civil rights leader at the time, Booker T. Washington, and arguing and challenging Booker T. Washington's accommodationist strategy. Trotter was way ahead of his time. He was arguing we need a more aggressive, direct action, in your face kind of civil rights strategy. So that fascinated me. And then I got to the part in his life in 1915 when he opposed in very out-of-time fashion, more like 1960s, the arrival of Griffith's film to Boston. So I look at that book as essentially as a protest drama, taking on this new thing called the motion picture, you know, the epic drama when it came to Boston. And I had seen, and it's an effort to put that movie in context, because time and again, like the first time I saw Birth of a Nation was in a film survey course in college, and Spike Lee had the same experience, and others who have been interviewed about Birth of a Nation. There's a PBS documentary that was broadcast last February on Independent Lens that's based on my book, and he interviewed Spike Lee. And everyone talks about how seeing it in a film study course, because Griffith was is regarded as sort of the pioneer of Hollywood and a film innovator. You would know a lot more about that probably in terms of his technique, that close-ups and editing and cutting. So he studied. He's a starting point in the study of American film, and he screened this movie, and the content is horrifying. But there's never really much discussion about the content, and that's what Spike Lee was complaining about. And so the book hopefully puts the film in its context of 1915. And then Jay mentioned, the second viewing of Birth of a Nation, which carried a different kind of impact for me, was in the late 19. I was a young reporter at the Hartford Courant, and David Duke's Klan was recruiting in, of all places, Connecticut, and was getting a lot of publicity over it. I mean, it is a story. And he kept saying, whether it was in the Current or the local Channel 3 or WTIC, the radio station and whatnot, that he has been so happy with the response he's gotten. We've got hundreds of new members coming from Connecticut. And that had everyone scratching their head. Why Connecticut? And this is the late 70s. But this is Duke saying it. And again, journalism is about testing information. And the Klan is a secret organization. He would not reveal or put us, we asked for it, for an interview with his Connecticut leader. He said, no, I'm the face of the Klan. It's a secret organization. They don't want to be public. So he's getting a lot of PR mileage. And he's got everyone scratching their heads in Connecticut because he's apparently has found supporters here, or supporters in Connecticut. So I had this young, crazy idea, let me join the Klan, the Connecticut thing, and we'll figure out the leader, and we'll figure out the numbers. And so that took I did that. I mean, it wasn't hard because in the recruiting drive, there are leaflets, and you fill out things, and you send it to Metairie, Louisiana, where David Duke is, and they send you back a little membership card and whatnot. Eventually, what broke, so we were able to do the story, is that Duke came to Connecticut as kind of a climactic moment in all this easy publicity he was getting. And he had a press conference in New Haven and Waterbury and this and that. And at the end of the day, he had a secret meeting with his Connecticut Klan, his Connecticut supporters. And that's where I was finally directed to a meeting where I met the other members of the Connecticut Klan, and you could count them on two hands. It was hardly several hundred, and there were a handful of biker types.
Fake news.
Fake news. David Duke's idea of a Klan meeting was to screen Birth of a Nation, the film. So my first screening was in a college classroom of film studies. My second was to realize the propaganda value of this film back, obviously, in 1915, but also certainly also in the modern era. And that was pretty startling.
And you point out either in your book or one of the interviews, Birth of a Nation played in Boston 360 screenings, ran from April through October.
Yes.
The normal movie ticket in those days was $25, yet Griffith was able to get up to $2 for tickets to see Birth of a Nation. So the movie had a huge impact, and partly because it was innovative and the biggest thing that anybody ever imagined. Up until then, it was like short films. Yeah.
They had they had 25 piece orchestra to play because it's a silent movie.
Right.
And that was powerful. The music. It had the ushers and usherettes. They were in period costume from the Civil War, that period, and the programs and stuff. So it was a spectacle that had legs, as they say.
Yeah.
It played for months.
Huge cultural impact. And of course, it spawned a rebirth of the Klan, which had sort of died out by that point. And of course, one of the things that Klan members advocated during the 1920s was the construction of statues to Confederate leaders, including in Charlottesville. That the statue in Charlottesville went up around 1924, I think it was, and that construction of statues actually accelerated again in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement then. And so partly what we're left with here is this notion of the Civil War and what was in play politically, racially, culturally, not resolved.
Yes, and the meaning of the Civil War. The rebirth of the Klan, which happened outside of Atlanta, Birth of a Nation, Griffith's movie, it opened, it sort of went a northern and then a southern route. It was L.A., New York, Boston, and then it worked its way into the South. And it was in the fall of 1915 that it opened in Atlanta and inspired a group of men. The Klan had really kind of fizzled to go out to Stone Mountain and burn a cross. In Atlanta, the reviews everywhere were almost always adoring and over the top. The Atlanta Constitution reviewer started off with, "The Greeks had Homer, we have Griffith."
Yeah. Well, and also there was a White House screening.
Oh, God.
Which became a big deal. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Are people aware that this film was the first movie ever screened inside the White House in February of 1915? And again, it went to the genius of both Griffith and the author who had written the book, the novel that Griffith had adopted, Thomas Dixon. Dixon and Woodrow Wilson, the president, had been classmates in college, and Thomas Dixon they had a friendship, and they wrote plenty of letters to one another. Dixon was a big fan of Woodrow Wilson's. And Wilson was a historian. And smartly, Griffith grabbed quotes and stuff from Wilson's history of the United States to use in some of the cards, the intertitles and stuff. And
in the film.
In the film. And it was Thomas Dixon who basically, and again, a lot of this is they're really smart, and it's almost like he's a Steve Bannon type of his era. Because he was telling Woodrow Wilson, you've got to see this new movie. A lot of it's about the technology of the film. It's so powerful. You've never seen anything like this. It's historical. It's about the Civil War. It's stuff you're interested in. We even relied on your work and whatnot. And he even wrote to the president that this kind of technology is going to have such a huge impact on people, on culture, and can reach so many people. And Trotter was, aware that on a single weekend in multiple cities, you can reach more people than you could in 3 months of newspaper writing or something like that. And so he's saying, this is film and stuff, but these kinds of things can be used in politics potentially as well. So Dixon had a lot of, foresight.
Mass psychology.
Yeah, kind of stuff. So he persuaded the president to hold a screening, private screening in the White House. He told Dixon and Griffith that his wife had died the prior summer. So he wanted it to be basically what they call off the record, a private screening. Didn't really want any publicity about it. He's officially still in mourning and whatnot. Doesn't really want it to be seen as kind of having a cultural event of any kind. And so he had the screening. He loved the film. He's been credited with the line of saying it's history as lightning. And some others have disputed that. I think he said something along those lines. But one of the things I found is that word did get out pretty quickly that there had been this White House screening, and it became controversial and something of a problem for the president when the protests began to emerge. But one of the things I was able to track down by doing all kinds of clip searches is that before that night was out, before he went to bed, Griffith contacted the sort of Hollywood film columnist at the LA Times, who was a friend of his, and leaked to her about this successful screening at the White House, so she had it in her column the next day. Didn't name her source. But I was able to track that down. So much for agreements of confidentiality.
And then a screening the next day for Supreme Court justices,
Yes.
members of Congress, cabinet members. There is a quote here from Wilson, and yes, who knows? I mean, it's not on video, so we can't really document it completely. But in regard to the film, it's like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true. Another quote from Wilson during that time: in the villages, the Negroes were the office holders, men who knew nothing of the uses of authority except its insolences. Wilson added that laws passed by Congress put the white South under the heel of the black South until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. So we don't think about Wilson often. We think about him as was he president of Princeton University?
Yes.
And the great foreign policy, World War I and sort of the League of Nations and things like that.
Yeah.
But
as a writer, one of the things that happened to come together in the historical research here, as a writer, it's almost like if you could make it up, you would come up with this parallel track, which I'm about to describe. I described, we just talked about the screening in the Wilson White House in the winter of 1915. Well, just 2 months prior, in November of 1914, my protagonist, William Monroe Trotter, had gone to the White House, leading a delegation of civil rights leaders to complain to the president for the second time in 2 years, the second meeting in 2 years, that about the Jim Crowing of federal government, the backsliding, the fact that the national government, which had been the hope of Lincoln in the Civil War of freeing the slaves, that was the last bastion of they had faith in the federal government. And here, under Wilson's watch, his cabinet was largely made up of Southern Democrats. Federal agencies were being segregated, white and black workers, separate cafeterias and bathrooms. So naturally, people like Trotter and Du Bois and Booker, they were not happy about that. And so in late November, Trotter led, again, for the second time in 2 years, a delegation to complain that things are getting worse, not better. And Trotter went on he was from Harvard. He was used to talking to politicians, smart people, whatever, rich people, you name it. And he pressed his case. Wilson was appalled. He interrupted and he cut Trotter. He threw him out of the White House. you can't speak to me that way. I mean, I have this long reconstruction. It's a great chapter in the book. And it made headlines, and the headlines were "Negro talks uppity to president," things like that the day after.
And he said that the black leaders the black constituents would need to find a new leader to represent them henceforth.
that you can't come into my Oval Office and talk to me this way. So you have it. When I look back to what I said as a writer, the juxtaposition of in November of 1940, Trotter has a hearing with Wilson and gets thrown out, and 2 months later, Wilson is hosting D.W. Griffith and Tom Dixon for this, horribly racist, epic film, The Birth of a Nation. That says it all in so many ways.
Another book of Dick's that is currently developing into a movie is based on a story called The Fence, about a cover-up of the beating of a plainclothes black policeman by fellow policemen during a chase of a suspected killer. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that in terms of the style of how you came upon that investigation, where it led you, because there was this wall of silence that followed the incident. And again, I think part of it, what I'm fascinated by in your work is how you find these huge, violations of criminality and their connection to established authority, and the maze that you have to sort of, make your way through, navigate to really get to the truth and the bottom of it. And these investigations take years.
They can, and that's one of the important points about whether it's the Globe Spotlight team or investigative journalism anywhere. It takes time, and you have to have the luxury of that time. Because most of the time, and even in daily journalism, you're after information that someone really doesn't want you to know. So it takes time to figure out, hopefully, a strategy to overcome those obstacles and to get around it. And then even if you think you know it, and then again, to go through the hoops, what I call of testing and verifying that information. Single sources often aren't enough. And even though you do believe it to be true, you just can't get carried away with what you think to be true, and you got to keep testing it and whatnot. The Fence, as Jay referred to, is another. I think you get that feeling that I like stories out of Boston. There's plenty of both now and then historical material out of Boston for sure. And what became the book titled The Fence also grew out of a Spotlight Team series regarding policing in Boston, the Boston police. And it was largely focused on police corruption. There was a group of drug detectives that we were able to build a case, build a story, an investigation around, that they were busting with cooked up warrants, search warrants, where they're supposedly relying on confidential informants, but they don't even exist. They're just making the stuff up so they can get into someone's apartment. They would make a bust and make an arrest, but if there were 10 grand sitting on the table, they'd only report 5, and they'd keep 5. They'd actually keep some of the drugs, and they had drug dealers who would deal it for them. It was real bad. And we were able to get into that. But then one of the related themes was, and this is the part that gets fascinating about policing, whether it's in Boston or anywhere, was the blue wall of silence, the cover-up. Starting to, these guys, in many ways, like John Collier, they'd been doing this for years, and people in the department, suspected it, knew about it, didn't want to know about it. So documenting instances of police lying, whether it's covering up, indirectly enabling these guys by not dealing with it, or just in how that poisons the police environment of what Alan Dershowitz, I think, coined the term test-a-lying, where police officers will lie under oath in order to make their cases, to simplify it. And we were able to document cases by, again, going back and sort of reconstructing the case where a drug dealer and a bust, and an officer testifies that he saw the drug dealer, the transaction, he was sitting in a car doing, surveillance, he saw the buy go down and blah, blah, blah. I was here on this corner of these two streets, the deal happened over there. We would go out there, and if you went there and you went to where the officer said he was and where the deal went down, there's a 6-story brick building in the way,
Yeah. So
You can't, you're not Superman, you can't see through buildings. So, you develop a caseload of instances of that to argue, that the police have a problem of telling the truth.
yeah.
And then that led to, again, some sources saying you should take a look at the Mike Cox beating. And that meant nothing to you. A lot of times, things, what do you mean the Mike Cox? And it turns out that Mike Cox was an officer in the gang unit, working in plain clothes with his partner, who was also black. They're wearing the hood and stuff and that because they're going in and out of bars. And they're working in Roxbury and Mattapan. And there had been a shooting in Roxbury, and whoever called it in first, in order to get a quick police response, said an officer's been shot. That's like yelling fire in a movie theater, right? In terms of, and that wasn't the case. It was. There had been a shooting, and there was someone who had been shot. But that meant all kinds of police officers from all over the city were suddenly pouring into Roxbury. An officer was down. And it led to this incredible police chase, which are usually over in an instant, but this one went on for over 20 minutes, and snaking from in Upper Roxbury towards Mattapan in the southerly direction and out of Blue Hill Ave, as police were chasing a suspect vehicle that would not stop and knew their way around. And more cop cars kept joining the chase. It snaked its way down to a dead end surrounded by a fence, thus the title. And out jumped the suspects, the true suspects, and they went there were 4 of them in the car, and one scaled the fence. And Mike Cox and his partner were in the next car, an unmarked police car that came screeching to a halt. Mike Cox, in his jeans and his hood, chased the suspect he saw going and climbing over the fence. He reached up to climb after him, and he was hit in the head from behind. He turned to look, and he was hit again, and then again, and again. It was Rodney King time at the dead end at this fence, as cops piled on and just pounded him, okay? Until someone said, "Hey, that's Mike." And they went, "Whoa," and Mike was, he was unconscious at this time. And instead of helping him, this is why it became a story, a big story. This handful of cops who had been, obviously committing police brutality, they fled. And there was all kinds of crazy commotion. More cars coming in, other suspects being arrested, lights, sirens and stuff. They just left him next to one of the cruisers, where he was found by other members of his gang unit. And he was taken by ambulance to the hospital. That we rolled this into our spotlight the year we were on policing, because when you're looking into this, the official explanation for his injuries was that he slipped on ice. And any reports that we got, police, after an event like that, all the officers have to file reports about the shooting, about the chase, about the apprehension of the 4 suspects who were apprehended, and the injuries to police officer Michael Cox. No one saw anything, except he must have slipped on ice. He was found there. No, I was here, I was there. There's a pile of paper signifying nothing. So for me, in all the stories that we had worked on this year about policing in Boston, that's the one that really stayed with me as a story that had, I use the word traction, that was bigger than Boston. It was about policing. It's about the police culture. If the blue wall kicks in, even when the victim is one of your own, what a way to show the enormous power of that gravitational pull to lie and circle the wagon and cover up when one of the victims is your own. And so that became, that was sort of my way in, was I writing about it first for the Globe, and then, writing a book that became entitled Defense.
And how long did it take for the truth to come out about what happened?
Well, and let's see, the beating was in 95. It's so funny, January 1995, two big stories happened that was the year that Whitey fled, January 95, at the beginning of the month. And at the end of the month, that's when Mike Cox was beaten, or slept on ice, I should say. Well, we didn't write about it. It took, I think, we wrote about it, I forget, the Spotlight series was, I think, in 97. And what I Do in the Fence, which I wrote in the early 2000s, was, the story was essentially over in terms of the dramatic arc, because Mike Cox, victim of police brutality and a blue wall of silence, was, and the chapter is called True Blue. When he woke up in the hospital in the days that followed, when he was home and recovering, he didn't like being the victim of police brutality, but he understood the mistake, that he was mistaken for a murder suspect. He expected the beaters to come see him and apologize. He was staying loyal to the
To the
department.
police department, yeah.
Yeah, but that didn't happen. No one came. And so that really brought, and he was a kid, he grew up in Boston, he wanted to be a cop. That's when he felt so totally abandoned, and he had traumatic brain injury and stuff like that, that he realized it ain't gonna happen. They've left me out there in the cold.
And then there was another police officer who was not an eyewitness, but who knew about what happened.
He actually apprehended the same suspect, but when the feds finally got in a couple of years later, they went after him assuming he knew what happened,
Right.
saw what happened, and I came to believe he didn't. It had the kind of tunnel vision. If you're running after something, there might be a commotion over here, but you're so locked in, and that became a whole fascinating secondary storyline. But the main thing, Mike Cox ultimately, after a period of months, he decided to take it all on. He said, "You can't do this to me. You can't do this to anybody." And he began cooperating with Internal Affairs, but that didn't go anywhere. He ended up filing in federal court a federal civil rights case against a handful of officers that he had identified with the help of his friends, who were the likely beaters. The police department and the city of Boston. He took them all to court in a federal civil rights case. And when he made that choice, once he made that choice, you think he was out in the cold when no one came to apologize? His tires were getting slashed. He was getting phony calls. He was getting calls, calling him the N-word and you better shape up. He was getting both police and fire. They were phony calls of a domestic disturbance in his house in the middle of the night. That went on. That's what he had to endure once he decided to take action and try to hold the criminals, the beaters, accountable.
I want to have some time for questions. I just want to get a little bit into Judgment Ridge and how you were drawn to that and what some of your conclusions were on it, and then we can talk a little bit. Also, Dick will be at the Vermont Bookshop at 5:15 to sign his books. A number of his books are for sale. As you can tell, they're sort of riveting, and one of the things that's unique about your work is that in writing it unfolds like a movie. It unfolds like a novel. It's nonfiction, but it's structured with scenes and dramatic development and character layering and all of the rest. I mean, maybe you could just talk about how it is that you try to present this work.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you get trained like this in Spotlight because you have to tell a story. Storytelling is so key. You end up, oftentimes you're getting developing a lot of dry numbers and information and statistics that you glaze over if the presentation was simply built around that. So there was this goes back years, but training in Spotlight is learning how to tell a narrative, a story. And so this kind of writing, Jay's referring, we call it nonfiction narrative writing, where if someone said, "Gosh, this reads like a novel," that's a huge compliment. But it's not, because everything is rooted in fact, in reporting. And there should be any practitioner of nonfiction narrative writing should, if asked, how did you know this on page 23, should be able to answer that it becomes from this interview and that interview or this document or that report, even though it's not in the narrative itself.
Right.
That's all in the background.
Yeah.
And the idea is to use all the depth reporting that you do, interviews, documents, going to places, and building a narrative that has a beginning, middle, and end. You don't make anything up, but you have you don't have to write everything that happened.
Right.
And pacing
So you
is
shape
important. Shape it in that sense, but everything has to be true. Building suspense when you have the resources. It could be a transcript of a bug if using that, but recreating the dialogue, the scene inside wherever the bar that was bugged, make that come alive and have them use those words. I mean, it's on some transcript you've gotten from some FBI tape or something. So using plot, character, and pacing and doing all those things to create a narrative. You end up developing, it's more of I would call it a novelist or writer's eye, to be able to pull it off. Rather than by detail, rather than just a straight journalist eye. And one of the examples I like to use is, has anyone, Truman Capote wrote In Cold Blood, which again, at the time it was groundbreaking in showing, again, journalists or nonfiction writers, the power of narrative nonfiction. The one footnote or caveat I'll say is that in the years since that groundbreaking piece came out, I mean, people have exposed flaws in the work in terms of it being some parts are fictionalized, but at the moment that no one knew that, and instead it was in the New Yorker, and then it was groundbreaking in showing us journalists what is possible. And there's a great scene that is the last day in the life of Mr. Cutter, the father. Clutter. Okay, sorry. Thank you for correcting me. The morning of the last day of his life, and it's a scene basically of him in his bathroom, shaving and doing all those kinds of things. And in my journalism class, that's a piece of really compelling narrative nonfiction. It's less than a page, but it's very detailed and descriptive. And so I say, how do you think Capote knew this stuff? Obviously, the man's dead. You can't interview him. And so we talk about different ways in which crime scene photos, interviewing family, police, learning that this is a creature of habit, and he woke up, did the same thing every day, verifying that this day was was the same as every other day. But there's a description there about the sink and the bathroom, and it describing the sink and the blue tiled blah blah blah. Now that's a novelist's touch. The blue tile makes you. It's so intimate. It brings you right there. Yeah. And so I asked my students, like, did anything jump out? And how would he know? How would he know that? Because my point to them is that is not something you would find in a state trooper's crime scene report. The blue tile. That is Truman Capote standing in the bathroom and noting that the tile is blue. Okay, from most journalists, that detail is unnecessary for writing the news story about the murder and the investigation. Yeah. But if you're going to try to pull off a scene like Capote does, or in any nonfiction narrative scene, that's when you go. You got to see it for yourself. No matter how good the law enforcement material is, you're going to go and you're going to notice blue tile, and that's going to be a small but important detail that makes it feel more like a novel.
Yeah. Well, it's an exercise of imagination and creativity to even to apprehend the material, to use the material, to weave it into the overall bare facts of the story.
Yeah.
So in Judgment Ridge, you covered it for the Globe and decided to pursue it and develop more in terms of the book. What led you to that?
Yeah, it sounds like a good number of you are familiar with that 2001 horrible murder of the Xantops. It was obviously a very big story in New England and beyond. Mitch Zukoff, the reporter I wrote Judgment Ridge with, was covering it in the news. I was working on the Sunday magazine at the time, and I ended up doing an assignment, a piece on Chelsea, Vermont, which is where the two teenage boys were from. I wanted to go there. And I think eventually, sort of after the 2 or 3, because it went for a month, I think, or so, that there were no, the hunt for the killers, and it went all different directions, and it stayed on the front page. It was a very big deal, and then it emerged that, Robert Tulloch and Jimmy Parker were the killers. I think as journalists, after, then everyone kind of went on, and there would be a trial the next year or whatnot. What interested us was we kind of just were reacting as parents. I had 2 sons who were, early teens, preteens. Was how could this happen? The why. I went to Chelsea, and has anyone been to Chelsea, Vermont? It's a wonderful place. I loved it, being there, and I loved talking and meeting people, and it seemed so idyllic. And how could 2 boys from and they were. You tell us, how could this happen? They were totally
Student council president.
and mystified how Robert and Jimmy, that they could ever have done anything like this. So it, and then because there wasn't anything to easily hang the hat on, like they were into drugs, or they were goth or dark, all that kind of stuff. The quick
They weren't.
the quick explanations. And I just talked to other parents. Everyone wanted to know why, or should they be worried about their kids? I mean, what's happening? Is it the internet? All that stuff. So that became our challenge that Mitch and I set out to do. It was in some ways harder to work that story because it was so horrible. Than it is working the Whitey Bulger stuff and the killings, because he's a killer. It's what he does. Right. And writing about murders. But this one was really unsettling. And we wanted to get into trying to figure out the boys and the why of it.
And what did you come away with?
A combination of things. I think one of the key things, and again, having help with this, reporters, I think, always should look for expert help when they can, and is sort of seeing Robert Tulloch as a what we called a budding psychopath, and learning all about that, and that seemed to fit. So he wanted to know what it was like to kill. He was a prime mover in it, and Jimmy, they had this friendship that in high school, where they had always been part of a group of friends, and that's why I interviewed a bunch of their friends, and they were totally mystified that Robert and Jimmy did this. It's such a small town. But they had basically gone invisible, hiding in plain sight in a way. They had spun off, even though everyone saw each other, but it was spun off and were spinning out. And Jimmy had a real theatrical way about him. So some of Robert's ideas and adventures of minor crimes, of breaking into empty homes, things like that, had a theatrical quality to it for a period to Jimmy. They became, and then they, even things that became metaphorical but very important. They began climbing together as an activity. And if you know anything about climbing, which I didn't and don't, but belaying, you really depend on each other for your safety. Right. That, I think, got deeply part of their friendship in terms of why, Jimmy would ultimately follow Robert down this, truly dark hole. So those combination things. And then the other thing was, and this is really sad, is that teachers in Chelsea, Robert was very bright, as was Jimmy, a handful of kids, small school in Chelsea. They kept accelerating the kids through elementary school to they could kind of skip and do things, and they finished that, so let's do that. By the time they were sophomores in high school, or beginning junior year, they were done.
There were no more classes for advanced kids.
They had done all this advanced stuff, and there was nothing left.
And the school budget was cut, and so there was no room to grow it.
And Robert, who again considered himself, he was lazy, considered himself the smartest kid on the planet, had all this idle time and started directing it, in these hideous ways. Other kids did other things without the challenge. They did internships
Right.
And some of the farm schools and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
They were motivated to find something more conventional to do with that free time.
And some parents with money sent their kids to Sharon Academy also.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a...
And he's going to make the movie.
Right. I spent a lot of time. I actually taught Robert Tulloch in a 30-day playwriting residency in Chelsea. So I have, and we shot a movie, A Stranger in the Kingdom, in their town. So it's a story that I do, if you
have a real
to.
connection, yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one more question. I'm going to open it up a little bit because I know people would like to ask some questions. So what do you see as the current state of investigative writing? I mean, the press is sort of under siege right now. I mean, for the first time in substantial numbers, people are choosing to believe different versions of stories, and to the extent that they begin to inhabit alternate realities. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, okay, that feels like two questions.
Yeah.
One about investigative reporting.
And one's about alternate reality, which
yeah,
maybe we
alternate,
shouldn't.
Well, no, as far as I'd like to talk about investigative reporting, but these
Sure.
others, I mean, you just have to stay the course.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the alternative? Not to do it because there's this alternate reality that's
Right.
has blossomed. No, and it makes it harder and more challenging, but makes it more important than ever to stay the course and do honest journalism or journalism. I don't want you don't have to be. Journalism is honest if it's journalism,
Right.
Even though it's becoming increasingly difficult as President Trump ramps up his audiences to go after journalists. I was listening to one of the public radio shows where someone was out in Phoenix or Arizona where Trump was, and they're starting to feel covering up their ID on their bags and stuff like that because
Right.
they're feeling like they're getting targeted. And they're starting to talk about eventually something ugly is going to happen.
There was a
where
lot
they're
of
gonna be
calling
attacked.
out in Phoenix and
Yeah.
sort of pointing up to the gallery, and it seemed like...
Yeah, so that, I mean, I think it's going to, it has a real potential to get uglier.
What investigative pieces have you liked lately that have sort of impressed you?
Well, I can't, in terms of a big project, I'm a big reader and fan of the Globe and the Spotlight team, and some of this it's pretty local.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the Post and the Times have continued to do, it's good, and it's investigative in terms of they're just pushing and pursuing in terms of the coverage of this administration. Investigative reporting, today, I mean, the good news is that there are still places like the Spotlight team, and as the Globe tries to reinvent itself digitally and has to experience terrible difficult cutbacks, they understand the importance of having a unit of reporters do that kind of journalism that takes time. And as you saw in the movie, there's no real glamour to it day in and day out, I mean, I think that was one of the things that was so good about the movie. About the most glamorous or the most, sort of Hollywood moment was when the reporter Mike Resendez was like running to the courthouse before it closed to get some documents. They had to try to get some action in it, right? I mean, and that never really happened, but that's like trying to, because it's like, a lot of it is just this painstaking grind to keep going forward. And again, the value of having that luxury of time is that most of the people who you say are after, or the accountability, or the government that you're holding accountable, they're used to putting up a hand, trying to stop you, putting up an obstacle. And most of journalism is fast-paced and daily, or even faster. And they don't have time to run around that, and so the person or the institution putting up the hand gets away with it. Just don't answer that FOI request. Say there's a delay, they didn't fill it out right, it'll take another 3 months. They hope, and it often happens, that your attention span, you have to move on. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't happen. Investigative reporters know about all that stuff, and no, we're not going away. We're not going away.
And the other frustration is when a great investigation breaks, and because of the news cycles and the density of just odd stuff that's happening, 4 days later, nobody's talking about it anymore. Because you want an investigative piece to trigger action.
Right.
And there's nothing a journalist can do about that, and it's not their responsibility to make sure. But the fact that they're exposing this can sometimes get lost in the shuffle. The Spotlight team does a good job of sort of heralding, this event. Really, it's event journalism in a way, and sometimes multiple episodes, of development. But anyway, why don't we take a couple questions? Yes. Yes.
Last week, in Boston, there was a demonstration organized by the white nationalists.
Right.
And the police and the powers that be had everything very separate. What I found most curious is that they didn't let the press. I know that I guess the organizers failed to get a permit to use a loudspeaker, so they couldn't project their message. But I thought it was curious that the police would not let the press to hear what they were going to say. Could you speak to that? Is that?
That doesn't sound good. You know more than I do. I was I'm not, I don't work at the Globe. I'm not familiar with, I was out of town.
I get that they had a full court press on to really suppress any possible violence and, counter-demonstration.
So what you're saying, the press wasn't,
The press didn't even get up to hear
what the
white nationalists
had to say.
had
That,
to say.
well, that's troubling to me.
Many of us are interested in what they have to say, but just the fact that the press.
Yeah, no, I see. I haven't read anything about the restrictions on the press covering the demonstrators, the white nationalists. But I wouldn't like that. That's to me problematic.
Yeah.
I was very happy to see 40,000 people show up.
Yeah. Sandy.
When you wrote The Last Mass, I was wondering what was the proportion of, did you get to have hands-on interviews as well as have information from your different sources? And how did that work out?
Yeah, you try to interview everybody who's a character, so to speak. A person of interest. So yeah, it was a mixture of the interviews, a mixture of FBI agents, and also gangsters. Whitey, when we were, we interviewed Bill Bulger for that 1988 series. We tried through Bill. We tried to interview Whitey. Again, this was during his Robin Hood period, but no, he wouldn't talk with us at all. Over the years, and again after his capture, when we launched the biography titled Whitey, I kept writing him in lockup and looking for an interview. And then finally his lawyer, who I know his name is Jay Carney, came up to me in the courthouse and said he's never going to talk to you guys. And then it goes to part of his pathology, his dynamic, is that because he would write letters to people, he would channel people. He didn't ever want to be in a position where he would be asked a question, a real question. He just wants his version out there. And there was a really interesting and good documentary that was made of I think it was called United States Government versus Whitey Bulger.
Right.
And I think it was pretty good. The one thing journalistically they have a problem with is that they obviously wanted to get an interview with Whitey. He wouldn't do it. But what he would do, and you always try and negotiate. I understand negotiating for interviews and stuff like that. But I think the filmmakers gave up too much, because what they agreed to do, in order to get Whitey's voice, which would be a get, right? It would be an element that no one else had for their documentary. What they agreed to was that they would film Whitey's lawyer, Jay Carney, calling Whitey in prison. And Jay would ask some what were unbelievably softball questions, and they could film that. So they had Whitey's voice, Jay calling, "Hi Jamie, hi Jim, how you doing?" and all that stuff. And then then Jay Carney would ask, "Did you ever kill anybody?" No. And I think they gave away too much. Sure. It was anyone who has been victim of. The city of Boston has been a victim of this guy, Whitey Bulger, should be infuriated that no one's it's his moment, his time. He's just spewing his and there's no follow-up, there's no questioning, there's no cross-examination of any kind. So no, he wouldn't. I wish it would have been pretty interesting. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, did Bulger have defenders within the newsroom of the Boston Globe?
Did
Way
Bulger
back.
have defenders
Oh, yeah.
within the newsroom of the Boston Globe?
You know your history.
Yeah, well, I've read some, of that, and how was the atmosphere within the newsroom between you and other people, who might have defended the institution that you...
The late great sports columnist Will McDonough
Yeah.
was a Bulger defender. He worked on with John Conley on Bill Bulger's early campaigns. Mike Barnacle, the columnist for years at the Boston Globe, who was really good friends with Will McDonough, sustained the Whitey Bulger Robin Hood myth in columns, and would never call him Whitey in a column, would always call him Jimmy. Behind all of that, frankly, I mean, with Will, it was the Bulger families. Will knew. Will used to go visit Whitey Bulger when he was in Leavenworth. Will would be covering the Red Sox, and this is all in our books and stuff. Will would cover the Red Sox, and they would be in Kansas City for those games, and he would go visit Whitey up in Leavenworth, bring messages from home and things like that. But what's really important and what's really sort of evil and frightening at the same time is that the spinner of the myth was John Conley. And again, we explore this in Black Mass a lot and also in Whitey, because John Conley knew Barnacle. I knew John. John Conley was a terrific, he knew anybody covering law enforcement. It was almost like in the scene in the movie when Weishak comes, remember the new prosecutor, he comes in with a couple of tickets, you want to go to the game? John was smart. And so he knew it was good to be on good relationship with reporters at the Herald and at the Globe, that he could shape public opinion. Because it was John Conley who was the leading propagandist for Whitey protects Southie. Whitey is a Robin Hood. He delivers turkeys. Reporters would write that from their sources in law enforcement, and that was John Conley. And so when all to put this all together, once it all comes out, it's fascinating in how Machiavellian it is. But he was cooking the books inside the FBI, John Conley, but he was also cooking through reporters, friendly reporters, the myths of Whitey Bulger.
So it's a story that
About journalism.
that engulfed all of Boston,
Yes.
and was indicative of a culture in Boston. I think that's what I found sort of unsettling and powerful about the movie. Partly, I was talking to Dick about it earlier. That Goodfellas has sort of an element of myth, and there's a little bit of romanticism. There's this just searing realism of this story, and just the magnitude of Bulger's criminality and the idea of this complicity inside the FBI.
And when you mentioned it was, like you said, it involved all of Boston. When we did Black Mass and we sort of figure all this out in hindsight, we felt it was important to, hold the press accountable to us, ourselves. And so we write about what I just summarized. It was unwitting. Again, if you're a reporter, John Conley's an FBI agent. Every reporter loves having an FBI agent as a source. It's a top law enforcement agency and stuff. You don't know what we knew 20 years later, but we were, unwittingly used in again, horrible ways.
Let's take two more questions. Yeah.
One of the great investigative stories of all time was got to be Watergate. Did you ever have a good source like Dick Throat, or wish you had someone like that?
I mean, the guide or the pathfinder, the one that tells you when you're going off track and on track. Yeah, I've had versions of that for sure, who aren't, and because I think basically the Deep Throat was I'm never giving you anything, but I am here as your sounding board and as we call him again a pathfinder, And that can be, in the beginning, the perfect sources said, here are the Pentagon Papers, giving you the document dump that you need to write the story of the century.
Right.
Deep Throat wasn't that. Again, he was. The relationship was what I just described. So there are a lot of stories where you need that to navigate the thicket of government and institutions and what's reliable and what's not.
But sometimes that source may have an agenda.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And then that leads to a really good discussion. It's like, for the journalist, like, A, figuring out what that agenda might be, and does it matter? And, you know, one argument is it doesn't matter as long as what that person is telling you is you verify and it's true. Because then if it's news and it's true, then, you know, most sources have an agenda, you know, of some kind. So you know, you have to, there's a lot of thinking that can go into it, but does it matter?
One more quick one.
A number of the issues that you touched on are associated with the emergence of the new journalism in the 1960s. That is the relation of fictional methods to nonfiction. And I'm wondering, thinking back to the book that you mentioned, Capote's In Cold Blood, whether you think that the model of the novel can be dangerously seductive for a reporter.
Can the model of the novel be dangerously seductive for a nonfiction writer?
That's a great question, and absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. And again, the fact that Capote's work has proven to be flawed along those lines is you know, troubling and problematic. But the temptation and has to be resisted, and that's, you know, and it's with students we talk about this because you know, when writing narrative nonfiction, that tile, you have to have seen that tile is blue. You can't go, oh wow, would it be nice? It'd be really nice if the tile was blue. You can't go there. It's almost like it's got to be like a third rail. You've got to have a conscience that's so throbbing that you get electric shock if you even start going there. That's what we try to drill into our students. Just because you're, you know, actually creating a scene and writing using dialogue doesn't mean you can't go too far. And what's really troubling is that nonfiction in the last several decades, as far as New York publishers are concerned, that's where the money is. And for most of the 20th century, the novel was king, but it's nonfiction. And so you have people that I don't think have that grounding in journalism or underpinning or that super ego or whatever, who go there, who do that. A famous, or at least in Boston, an example of a writer who does this or has done this is Ben Mezrich, who's a very popular and successful writer. He wrote a book about a group of MIT students who took Vegas, and it became into a movie, Bringing Down the House. It was all very successful. I was so jealous that, oh man, how come I didn't find out about this MIT student? Because he wrote a nonfiction narrative. But then there was someone, they did a takedown, you know, and this happens every once in a while, these scandals, you know, after the book comes out, it's a bestseller and it's made into a movie, documenting how so much is made up. And he, I mean, maybe to his credit, owned up to it about how he made stuff up, his dialogue. He decided, several of the student gamblers, number of counters, they were Asian. They were they're Asian, and he didn't think that name that would go well with readers, so he changed their names to Mickey Rosa. Was one of them, and instead of whatever it was. And then in the story, this takeout, which is just a keeper. I mean, I have it to this day, and this is like 10 years ago or more. Interviewing some of the so-called real people, he said, "We never did that. We never did that. This is not me. This is so unrecognizable," and stuff like that. And the author was quoted in this article, you know, in defending himself, saying something like, "Readers don't care," and I go nuts.
No. Well, Dick has been very generous. He'll be at the Vermont Bookshop. He is a leading voice in New England, finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. We're very pleased to have had him here at Middlebury. Thank you, Dick, and good luck.
Thank you, Dick. That's